Hey, so today I'm actually driving rather than walking. This is the second attempt I've had at recording this particular topic. I did one on a walk earlier this week, and I was doing the editing of it, and it just didn't work that well. So I've decided to re-record it, and so now I'm going to try because I've ran out of time to do it in the car. So I hope it sounds okay. So the topic of this week is sidebar resizing. So sidebars are quite common in web applications. It feels like in the last few years, they've become very common. You'll see them everywhere. And I just wanted to focus in on the resizing behavior. So this is where you, as a user, can come in and depress a pointer on the sidebar kind of out of line and move it sort of left to right, and it will change the width of the sidebar. And when you release your pointer, that sort of width gets set. Now, usually what will happen then is you'll store that width somewhere. I've talked about this in a previous podcast, but potentially in a cookie or in local storage or in the database, something like that. And so when the user refreshes, that width, sidebar width, will be preserved. Cool. So having a think about the details of this interaction. So the first thing to consider is, how does a user know that resizing is possible? I'm a big fan of the idea that if an interaction is possible, it should be visible at all times. Having something only be discovered on hover is not a pattern that I generally endorse. So when we think about this resizing, there's a lot of lines in an application, and usually the line on the outside of the sidebar is indistinguishable visually from other lines in your application. And so should you be adding some sort of visual indication that this line is different from other lines and has some additional functionality? And some applications out there make the decision that yes, they should. And a pattern that I've seen is that you'll put a little drag handle icon, in the middle of the line, and to sort of show that this line is different in some way from other lines in your application. Some folks will also put, say, the collapse button for the sidebar on that sidebar line. So that way you're kind of calling out this line as something different. Now I'm just going to step back and talk about a related problem space, and that is drag and drop generally. I've been fortunate enough to spend a lot of time wrestling with that domain, both in terms of the technical aspects of how it works and also the visual aspects. And while wrestling with that domain over a long time, with other talented folks as well, sort of thinking about visual patterns for drag and drop, something that emerged was the idea that drag handle icons are a really helpful way to show that something is draggable. But sometimes drag and drop is not necessarily a primary action for that entity. So let me explain this through an example. You may have a sortable list, and within the context of a sortable list, having an always visible drag handle can be really important, because that's the sort of the primary thing that people are going to that interface to do. On the other hand, there are some experiences, say a page tree that has navigation in your sidebar. You may be able to move items around in that tree, but is drag and drop a primary action or a secondary one? So the primary action, I would argue, in a page tree is navigation, whereas moving things around within the tree is more of a secondary action. That distinction is nuanced, but that distinction has been helpful to say for when we were just looking at drag and drop, to say when drag and drop is a primary action, make a drag handle visible. When it's a secondary action, you can make the drag handle visible on hover or on focus. To use that page tree example again, if you were to always show a drag handle, it can add a considerable amount of noise to the page, which can make it more difficult to parse if you've got all these icons everywhere, these drag handle icons. And you have to weigh that against, okay, that's clear that it's draggable now, but now you've added a lot of clutter, visual clutter to the page. So we sort of landed on this idea that for secondary actions will make the drag handle visible on hover or focus. So coming back to sidebar resizing, I guess we need to ask the question, is resizing a primary action or a secondary action? And I'm of the opinion at the moment that resizing is a secondary action. So it's nice, but it's not the primary thing you're doing with the sidebar. Potentially collapsing, toggling, it's whether it's open or closed is more primary. And so I think affordances to toggle that open close should be always visible, prominent, but resizing, I've mentally considered it a secondary action. So when I was wiring up my own app, I originally had a little icon on the resizing line to sort of show that it was a different kind of line. I just felt a bit too heavy, a bit too much. It was calling too much attention to itself. So I just decided to take it off and just sort of leave it as a normal line. And then when you hover over it, you see, well, a few things. So we'll talk about that now. So the first thing we've covered is, how do you make resizing discoverable? You could have something always permanent. I'm sort of on the persuasion that you don't have to do that. So then you go, okay, well, on hover, what do we do? And a pretty common thing is to change the color of that border line. And in a lot of cases, make it a bit thicker. So your border might be 1 pixel. And when you hover over it, you make the line 3 pixels. Now, usually you're not changing the width of the border itself to go from 1 to 3 pixels because that can cause other things on the page to shift slightly. So instead, what I do is I'm rendering an element effectively on top visually of the edge of the sidebar, the outer edge of the sidebar, which draws that little line. And you can do that quite simply. So you just on your sidebar, kind of the outer element, you set position relative, and then you use position absolute to make this thicker line on the outside edge, like the full height of the sidebar and positioned on its outer edge. And you'll have that 1 pixel line on the outer edge, and then you'll have this 3 pixel line, which sits 1 pixel over each side of the sidebar line. So as the user hovers over the sidebar, you see this nice big sort of thicker blue line to indicate you can do something. Now, that line, the hitbox for that line is really interesting. Now, how I do that line is that's the line that the user can grab to do the resizing. And it's always there. It's always in the DOM, except sometimes it's got a transparent background color, and sometimes it'll have a blue background color. And that's the element that you will use to start that resizing operation. And you'll change its color, as the user hovers over that line. So if that line is often bigger in width than what you see visually. So you may have the actual element being quite a bit wider, and then you might use a pseudo element like after to actually draw the blue part of the line or whatever color you want. And then the actual element that is wider is transparent. And the reason you use an even wider line is so that you're increasing the amount of area that the user can do a resize operation from. So instead of it just being that 3 pixel line, you might make it 9 pixels, and 6 pixels of that line is transparent. And that makes it a little bit easier to grab. I suspect you've used applications on the web where you're trying to do resizing and it's very difficult. It's very difficult to sort of grab onto a line because they've just effectively left it as that 1 pixel line that you have to try and grab, and it can be very finicky to try and get to. So increasing the area in which a user can actually grab that line just makes it easier to perform that operation. Making the line wider, even if it's transparent, you got to be a bit careful. So within a sidebar, sometimes you'll have scrollable content, and if that pushes up to the edge of the sidebar, the thumbnail of the scrollable area that you can usually kind of grab and do scrolling with that. If your invisible element is bleeding over the top of that, you can prevent users from actually scrolling by moving that thumbnail. So that's not great. So what you'll find is that, this thicker line trick is actually quite common, and it'll actually, instead of sort of being evenly distributed over the whole line, so say 6 pixels on one side, 6 pixels on the other. Instead, what will happen is, let's say you're using 12 pixels, will be on the against the outside edge of the sidebar. So it won't actually be over the sidebar content. It'll be over the main content. And that's so that you're not accidentally putting it on top of anything in the sidebar that's interactive. And usually your main content area will have some sort of padding around it. And so as long as your hitbox area for this resizer is equal to or less than that padding, you can kind of use that dead space as increased area for your resizer. Something I do on my resizer lines is I show a tooltip to sort of explain what is possible. So you can say drag to resize. You can also put in that tooltip the other commands associated with the sidebar. So you might have a command for collapsing or toggling collapsing. You may have some functionality around like click to collapse or double click to collapse. You can put all that kind of information in the tooltip there. Something I'm also doing is not only changing the color of the sidebar line, I mentioned that drag handle icon. So for people who aren't aware, that drag handle icon is just these series of dots. When you see it, you'll know what I mean. But for horizontal only resizing, usually it's 8 dots. So it's 2 wide and 4 long, and that'll be a drag handle icon. So on hover, what I do is I make that line blue. So that's in a pseudo element for, I think I use before for the blue. The transparent full width element is for the full drag handle, the resize, like you can start the resize from anywhere on that transparent element. And then I make the drag handle icon a child of that element. So and make it sort of sit in the middle there. Another nice thing that is quite common is when you're over that resizing area, you change the cursor to be the east-west cursor, which is sort of a little arrow that points left and right or east and west to sort of indicate that that's what's going to happen, if you depress your pointer. All right, so we've communicated to the user that resizing is possible. And then when they depress the pointer and start moving it around, we're going to change the width of the sidebar in response to the movement of the user. Now, usually there'll be some minimum and maximum bounds on that size. So you're just sort of moving between those values. And if the user moves beyond those values, you just ignore the ones that are bigger than the max and smaller than the min. During that resize, there's a really nice pattern, which isn't super common, but I think is awesome. And that is where if you're at or beyond the maximum size of a sidebar, you change the cursor so that it's the west cursor. So it's like, you can only go west. And then when you're, beyond the minimum width or less, you change the cursor so it's the east cursor. And when you're in that safe zone, it's using the east-west cursor. I'm sort of assuming the sidebar is on the left and you're expanding out to the right. That would be kind of flipped the other way if you had your sidebar, on the right-hand side, whether that's because of your document direction setting or you just, for whatever reason, have the sidebar on the right. During that resize operation, technically you could change the color of the line to communicate different things that are happening. So, for example, if you're at the minimum width, you may change the color of the line a bit. When you're at the maximum width, you might change the color of the line a little bit. I haven't seen that around, but conceptually you can kind of do what you want. I have seen some experiences when you're near the default width of the sidebar, when you're resizing, it will sort of snap to that width. Now that seems like a good idea, but in practice, I found it to actually feel quite janky. So what I'm explaining is, let's say you're within 10 pixels, 20 pixels of the default width. The sidebar resizer will sort of almost like a magnet kind of snap to that default width. And that does make it easy for the user to get the sidebar back to the default width if they wanted to. But what I found is when I'm doing a resize and it's quite fluid, it can almost feel like a hitch, or it kind of chokes a bit as you're sort of doing this fluid resize. It chokes on that point. Doesn't feel as good as I thought it would. I guess another thing you could do is change the color of the line when you're near the default width. And then when you let go of the resizing, it after the fact snaps that default width, which I think kind of you then need to ask the question is the default width all that important? You might have a default width for your sidebar. It might be something like 300 pixels. Does it really matter if the user can't, do you want to make it easy for the user to get back to that default width? And I'm not sure. I don't know if it really matters. Some apps make it quite easy to get back to that default width. Slack, for example, I think has a double click on the sidebar and it will return the sidebar to the default width. I mentioned you could do some sort of color or snapping thing, but I'm just not sure if it's all that important to be able to do. So yeah, the user's resizing, it's changing the width of the sidebar, and then they release the pointer and the sidebar's width is kept and you're kind of done. And that's it. If you're using React,
as a little bit of a tip during that resizing operation, I would recommend putting the live value of the sidebar width into a CSS variable and updating that variable outside of React. And the reason you're doing that is otherwise every single time the width is changing, you're doing a React re-render. And if this value is quite high in your React tree, that can be causing React to have to do a significant amount of work, which it just doesn't need to worry about during that resizing operation. And then when the operation finishes, you can take that final width value and put it into React state.
In some applications, doing that sidebar resizing can feel really bad. And that's because while you're resizing that sidebar, it's changing the width of usually your main content area. And if that causes the layout to need to be recalculated, then that can be quite expensive if you have a very complicated DOM or it's a very heavy DOM. That can feel really bad to do. Now, there are a few techniques around this which are kind of a bit outside the scope of what I was hoping to talk about today, so I won't go into those. Virtualization comes to mind. There are some other potential CSS tricks you could do to minimize the jankiness of that experience. So it's a fairly common pattern that if you click on a sidebar, the outer sidebar edge, the sidebar will close. Now, I don't actually know if that is a great interaction pattern. And the reason is because it's so easy to accidentally trigger that close, like that click, when you are actually trying to do a resize. Like you put your pointer down, you try and move it left to right, and maybe you accidentally click instead of doing a drag, and all of a sudden your sidebar's gone. You've closed it. So that doesn't feel great. It doesn't feel great to have a fairly destructive operation, that being the closing of the sidebar. It is so close in engagement to resizing. Pattern that I've been liking, but is less common, is to use double click to collapse. So you'll double click on the sidebar will mean like close it, and then you can still have your normal resizing behavior. That has the advantage of it's much less likely to accidentally close the sidebar when you actually meant to just do a resize. Because you're not usually going to do a double click when you're trying to do a resize. Like they're very distinct interactions. That said, double click is not a common interaction pattern on the web, even though it is well supported by the web. And so, that's maybe not the best because it's not super discoverable by people. People may not think to double click. Now you can mitigate that by putting the instruction in that tooltip I mentioned on the resizing line, saying, hey, double click to collapse. But still, it always feels a bit funny to reach for an interaction pattern that's like double click, for example. That's just not all that prevalent. Now, I mentioned before Slack, they use double click to restore the sidebar width to its default. So the trifecta could be click to collapse, double click to restore to default width, and then click and drag to resize. That sounds good. At the moment, I've sort of landed on, double click to collapse and click and drag to resize, and just no real way to go to default width. And this is a subjective call, but I'm sort of the persuasion that maybe restoring it to the default width or having an ability to restore to the default width isn't all that important to users. I mean, I'm happy to be challenged on that opinion and hold that opinion firmly, but it's just something I've been thinking about. Thanks for hanging out with me today as I went on this drive, and I'll catch you in the next one. All right, bye.